My name is Anita, and I am a parent caregiver, a board director at Home and Hill, and a retired educator and administrator. We, as caregivers, we need help and support in order to help our loved ones, even if we know that there are many cognitive remediation techniques that can work. We can work on attention, we can work on memory, we can work on cueing skills, as I did as an educator with students with learning disabilities. It's some of the very same strategies that we can transfer to people with cognitive deficits as well. However, who will train us is to train our children or our loved ones. Sometimes we cannot do it ourselves. We are too close to the issue. When we push forward, we get sometimes pushed back. So we need a repertoire of professionals who are going to help us. We need to develop with professionals a thorough and comprehensive individual treatment plan for our loved ones. We need full assessments of their skills, of their strengths, so that we can work on those together to improve the quality of their life, and to work on them on a daily and weekly and monthly and ongoing basis with good follow-up and follow-through. We as caregivers are there all the time. We give our full commitment to our loved ones, and we appreciate and value the help that we do get. And for those who see and understand our needs and our desperate need to help our loved ones to live a quality, highly functioning life back in society. We need to be heard, we need to be acknowledged, and we need that help to be given to us through our whole mental health system. Let's hope and pray that this becomes a reality for all of us.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I never get nervous giving talks because I give about 75 to 80 a year, but when I talk to families and caregivers, I actually feel a little bit of a heart race that I don't feel when I talk to scientists and psychologists and clinicians in the community. And it's because I feel more responsibility tonight to be able to try to communicate the work that we're doing when we study cognition and mental illness, and to try to help you understand how we're trying to move this treatment into the mainstream, how we can try to find ways to target problems that people with mental illness face with their attention and their memory, planning and problem solving in order to help really restore true independent living and recovery in mental illness. This is Emil Kraepelin, who was one of the first to really define schizophrenia, and he thought of it as an early onset dementia because he wasn't so struck by the hallucinations, some of the peculiar thinking, or the paranoia. He was struck by the difficulty that people had in memory and finishing their thoughts, concentrating on getting their activities done while they were on the ward. And Bloiler, who is the contemporary of Kraepelin, actually talked about the cognitive disturbances and the motivational problems as the fundamental symptoms of schizophrenia. He went so far as to say that hallucinations and delusions are explained by these cognitive issues and are accessory symptoms. Now, what do our main treatments target these days? They target what 100 or so years ago were not called fundamental symptoms, but were called accessory symptoms, the artifacts or the consequences of difficulties with cognition and thinking. Now, you're never going to hear me say that the medications are not important for schizophrenia and mood disorders, but I think when we focus only on medications targeting the dopamine system in schizophrenia, for example, or the serotonergic system in mood disorders, those systems don't care about your employability, your ability to live independently, or to initiate and carry on conversation. Now, in the time since Kraepelin and Bloiler, we know that there's been a mass deinstitutionalization. And what we learned 10, 15, 20 years too late was that many of them ended up homeless or in prisons or moving from boarding house to boarding house. There was a study by Morris Bell where he randomized people as they were coming out of an institutional setting to full-time employment, part-time employment, or to be on a wait list for employment. The people who were randomized to employment had a reduction in their positive symptoms and stayed out of the hospital longer. So this idea of getting people cognitively activated, getting them engaged with the community, seems to drive a lot of the success that we have, not only in functioning, but in helping people maintain some of their everyday living skills. You've probably thought of cognitive behavioral therapy, where we have the content of thoughts. What is going on in the mind in terms of the attributions that people are making about their own abilities, or the way they're thinking about others or the future. That's one type of cognition that's often the focus of cognitive behavior therapy. When I say cognition tonight, I'm primarily going to be talking about the other cognition, the thinking skills. How does the person process information? Is it efficiently? Is it with a little bit of a lag? Are they able to hold items in memory? How many items can they hold at any one time in memory? And how long do they hold it before it's forgotten? And then the really important, what we call executive skills, the CEO part of the brain, decision making, planning, being able to recognize that in this moment, what I'm thinking about doing might not work, so shifting my behavior, that flexibility in deploying the skills that people have. What are we talking about when we say cognitive impairment or cognitive challenges, difficulties with thinking skills? What we know is that it is certainly not a problem with IQ or intelligence. The average IQ of a person with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder, with major depressive disorder is not what is impaired. Okay, so it's not an intellectual disability, but what we see is some challenges in more precise cognitive functions, when we really mine into how is the brain efficiently processing really complex information, not the ability to understand words or think through visual spatial skills. That's the intelligence that's not impaired. So when we talk about cognition in mental illness, some people worry that what we're seeing, maybe it's just because the medications have done something, or if a person has hallucinations, well, of course they don't do well on cognitive tests. That makes sense. It turns out that cognitive impairments are not simply an artifact of long-term treatment or even the time where people are not treated. It's also not just a function of symptoms. There's another reason that we study cognition, and it's because a lot of our patients who we work with talk about it. They say things like, I just can't get my thoughts organized, or I have a really hard time holding a conversation in mind or shifting from one person to another. We often think about why won't the person, why won't my son or my loved one get up out of bed and go do something? And we think sometimes, is this laziness? Is it a difficulty with motivation? What is it? And if we think about the different cognitive domains, like executive functioning, speed of processing, attention, and memory, a lot of the behaviors that we see in mental illnesses do have some of their root causes in the difficulties in the way the brain is processing information, and then the person is planning how to act upon the world. Understanding cognition can give us a lot of insight into why we see hallucinations and delusions manifest. So we all have biases, right? We all have ways that we think about the world. Our brain is constantly trying to help us by categorizing things into A or B. It might not be that this person said this because they're mad at me. There might be 88 other reasons why the person says this. We jump to conclusions all the time. This is something we all do. And one of the really unfortunate artifacts of the movement toward relabeling mental illnesses as brain diseases that happened in the 2000s was that they did studies looking at how people thought, how the general community thought about depression and schizophrenia. And what they found is they learned more about schizophrenia when we shifted from thinking about schizophrenia as a mental disorder to a brain disease. But they also requested or rated that they'd like more social distance from people with schizophrenia. But if we think about hallucinations, how many of you have just about fallen asleep at night and thought you heard your name called, right? So when we think about paranoia, how many of you have watched, I don't know, like Saw 3 or some scary movie, and you go home and the curtain moves and you think, oh, something's happening, right? So I think it does take a little bit of work and effort from us to be able to talk about the dimensionality of some of the symptoms that people with psychosis experience. For some reason, it's a little bit harder for a lot of people to identify with that. One way I've tried to do that is by thinking about the jumping to conclusions bias, because it is something that we all do. we know that when it comes to delusions, one of the principal reasons that people form their beliefs is because they make a decision about the certainty with which they believe something earlier than those who do not experience delusions. Okay, that's one of the key features. And so we can actually test this. On your left is jar A. Jar A has 60% of the marbles that are red and 40% of the marbles that are blue. Okay. There's another jar, jar B, where 60% of the marbles are blue and 40% are red. Okay, so I'm going to show you in sequence a jar that's being filled up with marbles. And in this task, what we typically do is say, do you think you know which jar this is yet? And then how confident are you that you think this is jar A or jar B? Okay. Anybody confident they know which jar this is yet? No. Okay. How about now? No? Now? Now? Well, a little less emphatic no anyway. Right? So what we see on tests like this is if we ask people, make a decision even if you're not sure, and how confident are you in that decision? Even if people who are experiencing delusions don't make a decision earlier, when you force them into saying, okay, yeah, I guess it's A or B, they will often have more confidence in their decision than people who are not experiencing delusions. You can see that in the general population, there's overlap with the performance that a group of people with schizophrenia also have on this task. But we know that in a lot of our tasks, there's separation at the group level, but of course there are people with schizophrenia who aren't memory impaired or who don't jump to conclusions. So this task gives us some insight into studying how basic cognitive functions might explain some of the symptoms that we see. Now, when we look at the relationship between jumping to conclusions and delusions, we do see that they actually predict the onset of delusions for people who are displaying symptoms that appear to be at risk for psychosis. So I'm going to give you a test now where I will say some words out loud, and I'd like you as the whole audience, all 108 of you or so, to yell out the words that you see. Okay, that's all I'm going to tell you for now. You say the words you see, and I'll read some other words to you. Pigeon. Bank. Rabbit. Pearl. Bicycle. Monkey. Okay, now this is a memory test, and I'm going to ask you, did you say that? Did I say it? Or is it a new word? Okay, so just take a look through those. Nobody has to yell out the answers. We're not going to grade anybody on this test, but just to get a sense, how challenging is it for you to remember, did you say it, did I say it, or is it new? It's kind of hard, right? Now imagine there are 80 of those items, right? So then we can really explore memory. And what we're looking at in a test like this is not just memory, but memory for the source of information, a much more fine-grained way that we can look at how memory operates. We see that people with schizophrenia don't necessarily have, even if we account for memory issues in general, it's the source of the memory that seems to be an issue. And this is highly predictive of hallucinations. And the reason for that is that hallucinations are thought of or experienced as the voice in my head. But what we're learning is they're actually the attributions about your own thoughts and having difficulty recognizing that this is my thought. So what we wanted to do is look at, this is on my postdoctoral fellowship, I was working in a program where we identified kids who were showing the earliest signs that we thought might be at risk for experiencing a psychotic disorder. And we gave a test, that source monitoring test that I gave you, and what we found is our ability to predict the onset of hallucinations 2 years later could be accounted for with a lot of variance by how many times a person thought that the word that they said was a word that the examiner said. So I want to talk also about how the thinking skills and the thoughts that people have might interact with each other. So This is actually a study from depression, but I'm going to give you some studies from depression because I think it really helps inform us about how the thinking patterns in mental illness might interact with the thinking skills. Barbara Sahakian's group in the UK labeled this response that a lot of people with depression have to cognitive challenges as a catastrophic response to perceived failure. The way they came to this is through a number of cognitive tests where when they looked at the performance of people with major depressive disorder compared to Parkinson's patients, people with neurosurgical conditions, and schizophrenia, it looked like people with depression were actually experiencing the same amount of cognitive difficulty because their accuracy was much lower than the general community. So we wanted to explore this as well. This is a test called the NBAC. I don't know if people have heard of this. One of the nice things about a test like this is it gives us that opportunity to say, how's the brain working when it comes to this domain that we call working memory, holding information online as you're working away at a problem. So the NBAC is a working memory task where I'm going to ask you to make your favorite noise. You can hee-haw or bang your foot or clap your hands or whatever you'd like to do on first a low cognitive load task. What that means is if you see the same number appear twice in a row, make your favorite sound. So in this schematic here, you see 7, 5, 7, and then 7 again. That's where you make your favorite noise. Everybody got their favorite noise to make? Okay, there we go. Okay, remember, the same number twice in a row. This is great. So, you know, scientists never have this much fun. This is great, yeah. When I present this to scientists, they never enjoy this as much, so I appreciate that. So relatively easy, right? I mean, you can say you're holding one bit of information in your mind at a time. What we did in this was to look at accuracy, but we also gave a scale where we had people go from all the way to the left, the minimum amount or maximum amount of motivation and engagement that you felt in that task. How frustrated were you and how motivated were you when you did that task? So now, unfortunately, you're going to have the 3-back task, where you only make your favorite noise. This is usually the part where people take a bathroom break. Where you only make your favorite noise because the same number appeared 3 times ago. So 7, 5, 4, 7, boom, right? So this is really hard. So you can see 7, 5, 7, no, because that's 2 back, and then 7 again. That's 3 back was the same number that you saw. Same thing with the 5 back. Okay, 5 is 3 back. Okay, here we go. Couple of latecomers to that one. So what are you feeling right now? I'm going to skip through. Just to give you a sense of, like, did you feel a little differently on that 3-back task compared to the 1-back task? You know, your brain's kicking in, but also probably your psychophysiological arousal is kicking in, particularly if the person sitting next to you doesn't know you very well and you're worried about whether they're judging you. In accuracy, people are not getting that much worse as you go from the 1-back to 2-back. But as you go from 2-back to 3-back, people with depression start to deviate from the general population. They start to struggle more. But what happens when you ask them about how engaged they thought they were with that task? You can see the decline from 1-back to 2-back. Now, this is not because they're doing worse. They're actually performing at the same pace as the general population. So I told you Barbara Sahakian has this phrase, catastrophic reaction to perceived failure. This is a catastrophic reaction in the face of success. This is really interesting and challenging for us to work with. Because if we're trying to help people with their cognition, but they don't believe us when we say they did well, or they don't feel like they did well, and then they stop responding, how's that going to affect their ability to take their cognitive gains and move it into important aspects of their everyday life? So this is what we're studying. This model of how cognitive impairment, now remember, it's not an intellectual disability, and it's not dementia, right? But it's a significant and meaningful cognitive impairment. How do we get from that cognitive impairment to problems functioning? What does a little bit of cognitive impairment do? Did that 3-back feel harder than the 1-back? So imagine if you went from being here with your cognitive ability to here. So you go from as easy as the 1-back is, or sorry, as hard as the 3-back is for you, if that feels like a 2-back to you. That's going to make every task seem a little bit harder for you in daily life. So we see a lot of disengagement. And this is that way that this cognitive challenge might make its way into everyday life if people are avoiding cognitive challenges that they face. So if that cognitive impairment is keeping people from engaging with challenges in their world and leading to some difficulty functioning, people know the term neuroplasticity? People who live in a stimulating or activating or challenging everyday environment actually have the potential for more growth of neurons, more brain cells. Right? So what we've learned is that neuroplasticity can happen, but there are some fundamental things that need to take place. There have to be new activities that are challenging for the person and also rewarding. So it can't be isolation, and unfortunately that's what we see a lot of times. And so if this cognitive impairment that is not IQ problem, it's not dementia, feeds its way back into a lifestyle that's less cognitively stimulating because tasks are harder and and people are not engaging, that's how we might go from that mild to moderate cognitive deficit at first episode to some of the more severe problems that we see later on. So we're trying to disrupt this cycle of cognitive impairment and how cognitive impairment manifests in everyday life. The medications that we have don't really move cognition in schizophrenia or in mood disorders. People have persistent problems with their thinking skills even when the medications work for other symptoms. I'm going to talk to you about cognitive remediation, which is a treatment that is currently, as we speak, being reviewed in the Canadian guidelines for treatment of schizophrenia as a potential first or second line intervention that can be offered. I'm a part of the expert working group in cognitive remediation, and we tried to define this in the most parsimonious way possible. And we're thinking about the way that we provide a psychotherapeutic service that helps people regain some of the cognitive skills or enhance cognitive abilities and improve how they function in everyday life. These are data where you see that there are positive changes in brain tissue. So Sean Eck's study in Pittsburgh, they did a 2-year treatment. Now that's a long treatment, a 2-year treatment of cognitive remediation. And what they found is that in people with the earliest stages of psychosis, the declines in the gray matter or the structural matter of the brain responsible for learning and memory were staved off. They didn't happen for people who got cognitive remediation compared to people who didn't get cognitive remediation. So we see what's called hippocampal volume reduction. The part of the brain primarily responsible for learning and memory starts to have structural gray matter loss in the early stages of schizophrenia, and they were able to prevent that gray matter loss with this intervention. If you've ever looked for treatments of cognition, you might have come across an advertisement like this. And I want to tell you that sitting in front of a computer and playing games is not cognitive remediation. Okay, this is cognitive activation or maybe cognitive training. Lumosity in the States was filed with a massive lawsuit for the way they were trying to promote their program as well. So this is one of the ways. Now we do actually use a lot of stimulation. So we use computers. Sometimes we use other strategies to try to get people activated. Remember I talked about that cognitively understimulating life that people might lead. Targeted training where we can actually do computer tasks that we know activate the circuits that are often underactivated is one way we might be able to do that. We need therapists to help people think about their strategies. A lot of folks, mental illness or not, we get into a habit of solving problems the same way. And without getting that feedback from somebody that, hey, there could be a different way to solve this problem. And to think about going through life with a flexibility of thinking. How do I catch myself when my strategy is not working and brainstorm a new way that I might be able to solve this task? This doesn't always happen spontaneously. Now, unfortunately, we still don't see a huge improvement in functioning unless we add a lot of discussion or other ways of getting people to actually change the way that they're hoping to do things in the world. The take-home message here is that the way that you see cognitive changes manifest and improvements in everyday life is when there's a therapist involved and when the person is also engaged in other learning opportunities, vocational rehabilitation, a structured skills training group, employment, or something else in life. So if we improve neurocognition, or those thinking processes, we hope that that makes its way into people's everyday lives. But the inconvenient truth is we know that it's complicated, that there are attributions that people make. There are symptoms like depression or social anxiety, negative symptoms, or challenges in developing social skills. This is a quote I had in doing CBT with a young man with schizophrenia. And he said, "I don't know why I can't seem to come up with a way to talk to girls. It seems like all my friends have already figured that out. It's like they've already been through this and they know how to do it. I still don't even know what not to do." Right? And so I think if we go back to thinking about duration of untreated psychosis, trying to target hallucinations and delusions as early as we can, it's important to think about, these are strange terms that I've come up with, I realize, as I dookie and doofy. Sorry about that. But the duration of untreated cognitive impairment, duration of untreated functional impairment, these precede the onset of the symptoms of psychosis. So we really need to focus on that. So when we developed our intervention, we focused a lot on not just training cognition, but not just rehabilitation, but habilitation. What are some of the skills that you missed out on? What are some real-world experiences that we can pair with cognitive training to make it more of a social skills training as well? So this is the form of treatment that we've come up with, and it has a little bit of a superhero name to it, action-based cognitive remediation. We tried to add a lot of cognitive behavior therapy components. So we do a lot of goal setting with people early and often. We talk about cognition in a way that's related to their goals, not to the brain. We designed, with the help of the dollar store and a carpenter in our psychology department, a mock-up of the workplace. And so people did the computerized cognitive training tasks, and then they turned their chair around and they engaged in a real-world-like workplace simulation so that they could not just think and talk about their strategies, they could apply their strategies in that moment. Think about somebody in our program who hasn't worked in 8 months and might not get a job for another 12 months. We're asking a lot of anybody to be able to remember what we've talked about for their strategy and then apply it later on. We also worked with people to try to move them through that strategic monitoring, their ability to be able to be flexible about their thinking. And we encourage them with goal setting every session. So this was 10 weeks of treatment, twice a week, 2-hour sessions. And then we also asked people to go home and plan some things that they could do in their everyday life to be more cognitively activated. This is one of my favorite quotes. I missed the session last time because I was with my family, but guess what? They were playing a new game and I was the only one who could figure out the rules. This never would have happened. I wouldn't have even tried that before this group. So notice that she wasn't talking about how well she did at the game, but she had the confidence to approach that and go after the challenge in her life. I used to get so hung up on whether I could read 2 chapters of my book. Now I don't even keep track of what page I'm on. I just enjoy reading. I can focus and just enjoy the story, enjoy the moment. One of the real challenges that we face in all of this work is motivating people to come in and spend time with us and in a group and with others. And so in a lot of our treatments, we see half or a quarter of the people dropping out, and that's only people who are motivated to come in the first place. So we've really thought a lot about this, and that goal setting that we do, I think, is largely responsible for this much higher retention in treatment. So we see in ABCR, nearly 85% of people sticking with it and finishing the treatment. These were people in a vocational rehabilitation program, and this is one of the best findings that we had. 6 months after treatment, 60% of people in ABCR had gained employment compared to about 30% of those in traditional CR. Now we focus a lot on confidence, and I think this makes its way into job stress as well. I retired 5 years ago because I told myself my depression would never let me focus enough to get anything done. I'm announcing to the group today that I'm unretiring. I've just applied for my taxi driver exam and I'm starting a volunteer position next week. This was a 51-year-old woman who had retired at age 38 because of her first onset of mental illness. So we're seeing that a lot of people tend to like this type of intervention because it's motivated to their own individual goals. So when we look at the effect size change, how much is change happening in functioning, and this encompasses work, independent living, and recreation, we see that if the goal of our treatment is not to get rid of symptoms, or not only to get rid of symptoms, but to help people gain new skills and to function, then we can look at these as what I think should be first-line interventions for people with psychosis. So I'm on the working group for the guidelines. Wish me luck. It's a long uphill battle, but we're trying to deliver some of these psychotherapeutic interventions. There's a free online manual that my colleague and co-author Alice Medaglia wrote. This is a long web link, but it's a manual for family members and caregivers of those with mental illness to understand cognitive dysfunction and to apply some strategies in their own lives. There's also a free online training program by my colleague Beth Twomley, Dr. Beth Twomley in San Diego. This is called CogSmart. It's a little bit of a different approach. The idea of CogSmart and the compensatory treatments is to try to find ways to modify the environment to work around some of the cognitive challenges that people face. I talked to you a lot about some of the restorative approaches that we have in trying to improve cognitive abilities. This might be a complementary way, these compensatory approaches. And full disclosure, I think I get 12 cents per copy of book that's sold from the book that we wrote, but we've written a book for therapists to learn how to deliver cognitive remediation as well. And we're starting an accreditation program for therapists at Queen's University, an online training program to try to increase the number of people who are available to deliver cognitive remediation. This is my email address. I'm very happy to share with you any other thoughts or, of course, the slides. And we're actually doing ABCR now in New Zealand, in Galway, Ireland, in Japan, 5 sites in Canada, and 7 in the States. So it's a real growing movement. Unfortunately, 80% of those are in research labs. Not many of them are yet fully into the clinic. So bear with me as we try to make that movement. Thanks very much.